Welcome to Follow Your Curiosity. Ordinary people, extraordinary creativity. Here's how to get unstuck. I'm your host, creativity coach Nancy Norbeck. Let's go. My guest this week is Dr. David Weill, the former director of the Center for Advanced Lung Disease and Lung and Heart-Lung Transplant Program at Stanford University Medical Center. He's currently the principal of the Weill Consulting Group, which focuses on improving the delivery of pulmonary, ICU, and transplant care. He's also the author of the new novel, All That Really Matters, which follows his memoir, Exhale, Hope, Healing, and a Life in Transplant. David talks with me about how he made the shift from surgery into writing, how healthcare workers have historically been encouraged to deny the emotional reality of their work as a defense mechanism, and how that's finally shifting, the harsh and sometimes cruel realities of the transplant world, how fiction allows greater latitude in telling the truth about those realities, why transplant patients often like to go skydiving after their surgeries, and more. Here's my conversation with Dr. David Weill. David, welcome to Follow Your Curiosity.
Thank you, Nancy. Thanks for having me.
So I start everybody off with the same question. Were you a creative kid, or did you discover your creative side later on?
I think later on. I wouldn't say myself particularly creative as a child. I was into sports, and I did a lot of those kind of activities. Found academics pretty late in life, actually. So I don't think the creative side came out in me until much later.
All right. So would you say that it came out when you started writing, or did it start before then?
I think it actually came out as I was seeing things in my professional and personal lives that sparked the curiosity in me and sparked that creative part. I think I was drawn to writing, as many people are, because they saw a lot of things, experienced a lot of things, and had a lot on my mind that I wanted to put down on paper. And so I think it was a matter then of how best to express it, either through nonfiction or fiction. And for me, it's both nonfiction and fiction. And I think that that's where the creativity probably came from.
So let's get into that a little bit, because obviously you've spent a lot of time in medicine. Yeah. So how give us a little overview of how that came about for you, and then how you got into the writing side.
Yeah, I was in the transplant field my entire professional life, and I think in that field there's so much there. There's morality, there's ethics, there's life and death situation, there's courage, there's humility, there's high highs and low lows. And I think that in seeing all of that every day, I was walking around the hospital essentially looking over my shoulder to see if anybody else was catching all this. And I decided about 10 years into my career that I was going to start journaling. And so I kept fairly extensive notes about what I was seeing. And many of those notes made its way into my first book, and then some more into my second book.
You have a note on your website about a mother of two kids and having to go and tell her husband and the kids that she wasn't going to make it. And wandering off afterwards and crying. Yeah. And even just the little blurb is heartbreaking. And I think, most people see shows like ER and don't, just kind of think that that's reality, but we don't really think about what it must be like to be the actual person in a situation like that.
Yeah, I wrote that story in my first book, Exhale, and I remember that really distinctly, not only because it was just profoundly sad, a young mother losing her life and leaving behind two young children, that I got down on one knee and talked to and tried to explain to them what was happening as best I could. But I think it was even more profound than that for me, because it was the first time I'd ever cried inside of a hospital. And I had been in a hospital setting since I was in high school. I started working in hospitals when I was 15 years old. And although I saw a lot of sad things happen in hospitals, I think all of us do, I never really got emotional the way I did in that particular scene, and actually wanted to sort of hide that from the rest of my team And so went into a storage closet in the hospital, supply closet, and cried my eyes out. Incredibly sad scene.
Did you ever talk to anybody else who admitted they'd done the same thing?
Later, I did. At that time of my career, and I would say my own emotional development, I was more trying to hide the emotion that I was experiencing in the hospital. And as we do, a lot of healthcare workers do this. We don't really share that with one another because it seems weak, overly vulnerable. And, a lot of our mantra, a lot of what we're taught in medical school is just go on to the next patient and, don't wear your own emotions on your sleeve. So you walk around with this armor around you that I had most of my career and then started to shed much later in my career. It really hit me that was what was happening to me, because I wasn't really someone that looked at myself as very emotional in terms of my own patients, but I became that way, certainly.
That's really fascinating to me because it seems to me that in a medical setting, you are by definition in a place where you really can't avoid emotional situations. So to try to live that way is massive denial of what's going on around you. And I can see where on the one hand, it's survival to try to just say, move on to the next patient. But on the other hand, it's got to take a toll on you.
I think it does, and it did with me. And I think it in working with a lot of healthcare teams now, in the role that I have now, I see that it's taken a toll on a lot of us. And this was well before COVID, but certainly exacerbated during COVID. And it's a defense mechanism, and it's something we really are taught early on to use to kind of shield ourselves from the emotional ups and downs of doing this kind of work. But there's, to your point, I don't think there's any denying what's happening, and the body does know and the mind does know what's happening. And as I've sort of reached the end of my run in the clinical arena, in the hospital arena, I realized that it was time for me to change gears and do something else.
Yeah. Do you think that needs to change, or do you think that defense mechanism is necessary?
I think it needs to change, and I think it actually is changing. I think COVID brought to light the emotional duress that our healthcare workforce is undergoing. And I think there's a lot of healthcare institutions that have taken measures to address that. And I think there's also much more openness now for people that are working in healthcare to share their stories and their emotions with one another, which I think is a positive trend. And I think that's going to be very good, especially for the younger generations coming up. I think that's going to be very important. And I see it changing. Is it changing fast enough? Probably not, but I do see it changing.
Yeah, what's coming to mind is I talked to a woman named Carrie Maluista a couple months ago who actually started a writing program for healthcare workers during the pandemic and got a lot of response very quickly. So I think there's a lot of self-identified need there at the very least. So
I think you're right. And I see a lot of healthcare workers doing just what you talked about. They're starting to write. There's a whole area of medicine now called narrative medicine, which is storytelling around the hospital experience, either from the patient side or the healthcare worker side. I get invited to talk at medical institutions, and they have these humanities lectures. They didn't have any of that when I was working on the front lines, and I see that only as a positive trend. Yeah.
It could be very interesting to see if there's a whole new genre of medical writing coming up.
I think so.
So how did writing end up becoming more important to you as you moved through your career and transitioned into what you're doing now?
I think it both inform the other. In other words, I see things that I'm passionate about and want to write about them. I write a lot of op-eds and essays for various publications, in addition to the long form, which are the books that are, different animals. But I also think that in thinking about these issues and expressing them, I can actually help the healthcare teams that I work with more because I've really thought deeply about what they're experiencing, and I can try to give them the best advice I can about, number one, how to do their jobs better, but also how to stay healthy from an emotional and physical standpoint. Things that I didn't necessarily have when I was working on the front lines. It was, I had to keep my own counsel, as they say, and on my own.
Yeah. So the first book that you wrote is a memoir.
Right.
And this one is a novel.
Yeah.
I haven't read the memoir, but reading the novel, I get the sense that there is a lot of you in it. Yeah. So I'm curious to know what it was like writing both of them, actually. Like, how are they similar and how are they different?
Yeah, I think when I wrote the memoir, it was obviously me. As memoirs are, they're all about the author.
Right.
Self-indulgent in that way. And I think that with the novel, there are parallels between me and the main character. The main character was in Transplant. I was in Transplant. He liked to ride his bike. I like to ride mine. He spent some time in New Orleans. I grew up there. I think the similarities pretty much stop there, though. The characters in the book and the setting was all informed about from what I saw. I mean, I didn't make all of this up out of thin air. I ran up against a lot of interesting people while I was doing this kind of work, and so it made coming up with characters pretty simple. But I wouldn't say that Joe Bosco, the character, and David Weill are the same kinds of people. I like to think I'm a better guy than he is. That's in the eye of the beholder, I suppose.
Well, he does go on quite a journey.
Yeah, he does. He does.
Yeah. I thought it was very interesting to watch him, and I don't want to give away too much here, obviously, but he has an interesting emotional arc because he makes one career decision that you kind of watch him make this decision and you're kind of going, I don't think you're going to be happy there, man. I don't think you're going to be happy there. And he kind of is on the one level, but it ultimately just doesn't work. It doesn't work well for him. And you see it coming, but not in the way that it all falls apart for him. But you kind of see that image that surgeons can have of kind of becoming God in their own mind, which is exacerbated by that decision that he makes. And one of the things that I found really fascinating that you brought out intentionally or unintentionally, as a writer, I know sometimes your themes are not as intentional as you realize when you're writing it, but the idea that he's kind of addicted to his patient's gratitude, like he feeds off of it almost. And I just found that so fascinating because I had never really thought about it before. I think when I've encountered that notion of that God complex, that it had always seemed to me more like a power thing and not something that came from that, oh, my patients are so grateful because I saved their lives kind of aspect. And I'm just curious about how that came about for you, or where that sort of fits into your own experience.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very perceptive point. I think that my observations of other people working in my field, especially transplant, is different. It's unique. I think that you saw all sorts of motivations for doing the work. I mean, yeah, we got paid well, and so money could be a motivating factor. Power can definitely be a motivating factor. I worked in academic medicine my whole life, at big institutions like Stanford. And yeah, power was a big deal there, as it is most places. But I think there's also a subset of people, and I might include myself in this area, where the most important interactions of the day were not when the check arrived in the mail or when I got a new title. It was when I was talking with a patient and they said, "Wow, you saved my life. I owe you everything." And that happened pretty regularly. And I think that there's very few people that would be not changed by that, not influenced by that, if you hear that day after day, year after year. So when you look in the mirror, just like my character did, and I have scenes of him looking in the mirror, the question is, what do you see? And I've thought a lot about identity, while I was writing this book. My character looked in the mirror and he saw somebody that in the course of an operation could change somebody's life. They knew it, he knew it, and the people he worked with knew it. And I even write in the book that if you don't think that influences how you look at yourself in the mirror, then you've got another thing coming.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And yet at the same time, the scene where he's like first told, okay, go for it. It's your turn to do this operation. I was reading that thinking, oh my God, I'd be terrified. I'd be absolutely terrified.
Yeah, I've said this before, that when you're, especially in the first, like, say, I don't know, 10 or 15 years while you're on the learning curve in medicine, it takes a long time to learn how to do this. There are moments of extreme terror, and don't let anybody tell you differently. You're terrified. I mean, you're truly terrified. Now, sometimes that terror can be motivating, get you to focus and work harder and study and do all sorts of things. But it's terror nonetheless. That goes away. At least it did for me, where you feel comfortable that you know what you're doing. But it takes 10 or 15 years to get to that. But I remember very well those early patients when it was just me and the patient. And I tell you, my heart rate was clicking away.
I bet. Yeah. I kind of have this image in my head now of a graph where like the terror line is slowly going down and the gratitude effect line is slowly going up.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I remember when I was in training, an early mentor of mine, who I remain friends, with to this day, I was a trainee, and he would walk through the waiting room on the way to see patients when we were together, and the patients would all stand up and start clapping for him. And I was like, aha, that's why he is like he is, And, if you get that attention every day, it's going to go to your head.
Did you know anybody that had that kind of attention but wasn't affected that way by it?
I think I did. Yeah, I think I did. I think they at least weren't outwardly affected by it. I think, there's certainly maladaptive behaviors in medical settings. Some people drink too much. Some people have extramarital affairs. Some people become gratitude junkies, and some people are wholly well adjusted and they do their job and they don't have seemingly any kind of character flaws. So yeah, I think it happens. I don't think it happens as commonly as most of us want to think it does, but yeah, it happens.
Yeah, I was just kind of wondering, like, what grounds the people who are able to do that.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about that because, in my own journey, I wanted to make sure that at least the best as I could, that I stayed grounded. And I think it comes down to family, friends, your faith, if that's something that, is important to you. And I think that the folks that adjusted the best to that had those 3 F's in place pretty firmly.
Yeah. So did you have a moment where you kind of, looked at that person and said, oh, that's why they're that way, and I don't want to be like that?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think especially early on, there were people that I encountered in the hospital setting that were leading a life and doing their job in a way that I did not. I did see all of it. I saw the extramarital affairs in the hospital. I saw the too much drinking. I saw the, profound ego displays and all sorts of anger issues and, you name it. And, I tried to steer, and I think I did steer away from all of the really bad behaviors. But, there was at times when I probably wasn't a day at the beach either, And, I think that, you have to own that and just say, well, I'm going to try harder, and that's what I tried to do.
Yeah, we are all human after all. Though I'm also wondering now if what we were talking about earlier with the whole, denial, go on to the next patient kind of feeds into that too. If you don't have an outlet for everything that you're seeing and experiencing, that probably tends to lead towards some of the behavior that you really don't want to exhibit, but it's got to go somewhere.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that, the dizzying part about transplant is you could have a great outcome and save somebody's life in the morning, and then in the afternoon, a patient you care about deeply dies, and then somebody else needs a transplant that comes and sees you the next hour, and they're new to the process, and you have to start again. Or you're in the ICU room and somebody passes away and they wheel another patient in the same ICU room, and you have to, so you're constantly kind of having to reset yourself, which is exhausting at times.
Right. And if in the morning you're a savior and in the evening you're suddenly a complete failure, that's a lot to deal with in a single consciousness in a single day.
Yeah, well, it was for me. I mean, that's why even when I started out on this, field when I was 31, 32 years old, when I was fully trained by that time, I kind of thought I had about a 20-year rip in the hospital, and then I was going to do something else. And in fact, it worked out to be almost exactly 20 years, and had gone to chapter 2 of my professional life.
Is that about average, or does it vary widely?
Mine was probably a little faster. I think that there's some, and I'll be frank about this, I think there's some people where they probably should leave earlier than they do. A lot of people don't have either an option or the creativity or the wherewithal to think of another career path. They have real life concerns, and I get that. And I think that, especially in transplant, I don't think you see a ton of old transplant doctors walking around the hospital. I walked out, at least from the front lines, from Stanford when I was 52 years old. And it was time for me. Are there people that go a bit longer than that? Sure, but probably not a lot longer than that.
Wow. I mean, there's a part of me thinking that's kind of a shame because you need people with experience to train up the next set of people. But at the same time, I'd imagine that burnout comes pretty quickly just because you are on that emotional roller coaster.
Yeah, I think it's accelerated in our field. And not to say that other fields of medicine aren't intense, they are. But I think in our field especially, it's a 24/7, 365 kind of endeavor. We didn't really have time off per se, just because of the nature of transplant happens when it happens. You don't have a whole lot of choice about when you do the operations. So I think it probably happens sooner in the transplant field.
Yeah. Yeah. So you get into a lot of detail in the book about the process behind the scenes, the meetings, and, how it's determined who goes on a list. And then you also get into the ethical considerations of who goes on a list, which was certainly eye-opening. And I think a lot of people would be surprised by, just how bureaucratic some of that is.
Yeah.
And I get the sense that was part of why you wrote the book and part of what you're working on now. Has it changed much since you started working on the book?
No, it hasn't changed much at all. And, yes, part of why I wanted to move to fiction is that I could have more latitude about telling things a little more closely to how they were. It's difficult when you write a memoir. You don't sit down to write it to settle scores or to hurt people.
Mm-hmm.
That's certainly not my intention. I think with fiction, it does give you the latitude to tell a more complete story, and that's what I tried to do in the book. I think I was clearly making commentary about our healthcare system, and the difficulty of the ecosystem right now, to work in it. I don't think it's a real secret that, healthcare has lost its humanity and it's lost a lot of its soul because we do put profit over the purpose of it all. And I definitely wanted to make that point loud and clear in the novel.
Yeah, I mean, the hospital that's kind of at the center of the story is pretty clearly a for-profit hospital, which is still an idea that kind of makes my head hurt that such things exist, even though, am I surprised? No.
I think that, hospitals are interesting places right now. They have the public face that they show to patients. We're here to help you. We believe in you. We're all about you. We just want you to get better. Nothing else matters to us. That's not true. It's simply not true. I don't think, I haven't met a hospital administrator that didn't want patients to get better. I've never met anybody like that. I don't think they would be in healthcare, but they are running a huge business that not only has to be responsive to Wall Street and shareholders and all sorts of people, but they're trying to make money. And it's pretty obvious when you work in healthcare that that's an important goal of the environment. And in the novel, I wanted to be sure that I showed that not only impacts patient care, it impacts the people that work there, because they're trying to, on the one hand, just save the patient in front of them and give them a good outcome. And on the other hand, you've got all these people behind you that are counting the beans, as it were. And that's a tough environment. That's what's going on out there right now.
Is there, and this almost seems self-evident, but is there a moment where new med school grads are suddenly hit with this reality? And if so, I mean, I can't imagine it goes well.
No, it doesn't go well. And unfortunately, it's driving some people out of medicine, especially young people who are more idealistic, and especially this younger generation who I think is interested in greater goods. And I think it happens gradually. At first, you see it while you're in training and you think, well, yeah, I mean, we understand there's money involved in this. And then you see it more and more, and you're saying at some point, not only is money involved in this, it actually may be the most important thing in this. And you see then, especially if you get into a leadership role, you interact with people that are running the business more and more, and you hear from them and you see that they are trying to make money, and they hope the patients do well. And I wouldn't say otherwise, but they are clearly trying to make money. And sometimes care gets compromised because of that. I don't think that's any secret.
I imagine that there's a moment where there's a clash with those people, but probably also an internal clash.
No question about it. There's a doctor, Dr. Wendy Dean, who I'll give a shout out to, who I think has mainly created this term. If not, she certainly has popularized it, called moral injury. Moral injury happens in the healthcare workforce because of a misalignment in values between those of us who provide the care and those that are running the business. I don't think that they necessarily have to be in conflict with one another, but they often are. I think when things went the best when I was working in the hospital is when I partnered with the people that were running the hospital to give them what they wanted and to get what I wanted and to work together. Now that doesn't happen all the time. It may only happen some of the time, but that's the goal. So I do think it's a moral injury of sorts.
Yeah, I mean, there are examples in the novel that, I mean, it's really one example, but obviously of a situation that happens fairly regularly that seems downright cruel, of keeping someone alive to meet a 1-year anniversary because that means something larger for the institution, when it's just cruel.
Yeah, and I'm afraid all of the things that I wrote about in the book, whether it's that issue, keeping a patient alive for a year so that the survival statistics for the program look better, I didn't make any of those up. I mean, they were fictionalized about
Right.
it, but I didn't create that out of thin air. It's not science fiction.
Yeah, I didn't think so.
So I think, would patients be disappointed to know that? Sure, I would be. But does it really happen? Absolutely.
Yeah, it just seems like, is it really medicine at that point, or is it just number crunching statistics?
It's the latter.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you, I mean, you mentioned partnering with those folks to, as much as possible, make sure everybody gets what they want, but how do you reconcile that for yourself when it's not possible to make sure that everybody gets what they want?
It becomes difficult, and it's one of the reasons, frankly, that I left the clinical front lines. Is, I just didn't feel like it was happening enough to my satisfaction. Now, there's other people that may have a different opinion, but to my satisfaction, it wasn't happening enough. But now I work with those people in my consulting role in a similar fashion, and I know what they want, and I know what the clinicians want. And I try to figure out a way to come up with solutions that everyone can get what they want. And I like to think that I have an impact on that. But does it happen every time? It doesn't. It doesn't. But I think it's something to strive towards, certainly.
Yeah, absolutely. And how long have you been doing that?
I left Stanford in 2016 and then opened a consulting practice, and we go around and help transplant programs and also ICU situations. We just help them improve. We help them improve from a clinical standpoint, team dynamics, financial, administrative, you name it. We just help them perform better. And, I like to think, as opposed to being the quarterback, I'm more of a coach at this point. And it's a role that I accept. I think it's great. I've really enjoyed it. There's nothing that replaces the one-on-one contact with the patient, but this is about as close as you can get.
So how does that leave time then to write? Because obviously it does.
Yeah, it does. I split the day in half. I'm a morning writer, so I write up to lunchtime when I usually can't take it anymore. It's hard work. and I get a bite to eat, and then I switch gears and do my consulting work usually in the afternoons.
Oh, that's cool. That's very cool. So the title of your book, tell us about how the title came about.
Yeah, I struggle with titles. I'm terrible at it. My publisher titled my first book. The second book, I got tons of advice about how to title it. And finally, I just sat down with a big glass of wine and, tried to figure out, what is this guy really looking for? What is the main protagonist in the book? What does he want? Well, he's trying to figure out all that really matters. And I said, why not that? So all that really matters is a reflection of what this guy is trying to figure out in life. And I think frankly, I think all of us are trying to figure that out, and in one way or the other. We have time on our hands, and how we spend it is largely up to us. And so I think
Yeah.
we're all striving every day to figure out all that really matters.
Yeah. Did you, when you were working with transplant patients, did you see people shift what they thought mattered as a result of that experience?
Yeah, definitely, definitely. It's an education. I mean, it's the education of a lifetime. To see patients will tell you what matters to them as they're facing death, and I think that is profound. But also, in medicine, we pick our field when we're pretty young. I mean, I was in my late 20s when I decided to go into transplant, and we change as people during the course of that career. We don't stay the same. My wife and I had a couple kids. That changes everybody, I think. My father passed away during all of this, to whom I was very close. That changed me. And, during the course of my career, I saw some patients live and some patients not live. That changed me. So I think it's difficult to pick a career or pick a field of medicine when you're so young and expect that to sustain you and be perfectly static for the rest of your life. That's just not particularly realistic, I don't think.
Yeah, I think that's probably true for everybody, but maybe even more for doctors.
No, I think it is. I mean, I've read, and I'm sure you've read, that people have more than one career, sometimes several careers these days. Whereas I think in our parents' generation, it was probably, you pick a job and you do it,
Right. Right. Yeah. Do you have a favorite transplant story?
I have a lot of them. I tell a lot of them in my first and second books. And I think the most important stories to me generally were the ones where we took young people, and especially young people, and we took them from a certain death situation and saved them at the last minute. I mean, I'm prone to the drama just like everybody. And, when you're running out in the middle of the night and doing this kind of work, that's what you live for, when you're able to do that, when you turn somebody around like that. And I think those are the things that I remember as I look back on this career. The people that not only do you save them and that feels good, but then you get cards and letters and pictures from them as they live their life and they get married and they have kids and they climb Mount Rainier and they do this and they, on and on. That's all that really matters. I mean, that's what it's really all about. So I've been fortunate enough to stay in touch with some of the patients that I helped, and that's quite important to me.
Yeah. Do a lot of them really get into skydiving? Because you mentioned that.
Yeah. For reasons that are absolutely unclear to me. There was a couple of things that, patients would do, especially young patients. Skydiving seemed to be one of them. I don't know what it is about getting a transplant that makes you want to jump out of a plane, but we had that. We had a lot of patients get tattoos of various sorts, all kinds of different things that, I wasn't necessarily in favor of. I had nothing particularly against skydiving or tattoos, but I it's not for me. And so I think it was just a reflection on patients wanting to squeeze every bit out of life. And they just said, look, I got this second chance. I'm going to do whatever I want. And I'm going to, climb a mountain, jump out of an airplane. And I was mostly for it. Sometimes I would say, I wish you wouldn't, but patients would generally do it anyway. So
I can kind of see where if you felt like you'd suddenly got a second chance, jumping out of a plane might feel like the most alive thing you could do.
I think that's right. I think that's right. My daughter actually went skydiving last year. She was 21. And I asked her why, and she said, it just makes you feel so free and alive. And I said, okay, all right, I'll buy that. That sounds good.
Yeah, I can see that. I'm pretty scared of heights, so I don't think I'd ever do it, but you never know.
Why not for me?
Yeah. Yeah, I can see where, from your point of view, you might be kind of thinking, I just put a new set of lungs in you and you're going to risk them jumping out of a plane.
That thought did go through my mind.
Yeah, yeah, I can totally see that. Totally see that. So, how was it for you to take your experiences and put them into this fictional character based somewhat on yourself and somewhat on other people and somewhat, I'm sure, totally on stuff you completely made up?
To be honest with you, I know this isn't a popular thing for authors to say because I think authors tend to say, well, God, it's hard work. And it is. I had a blast doing it. I'd like to do it again one day. My third book, I already signed a contract to write. It's going to be nonfiction, but I may return to fiction because I really had quite a good time doing it. Just imagining things. I don't know that I'm going to write about a medical setting anymore, but I have a good time imagining, what could happen. If my life, for instance, had gone right instead of left, what would have happened? And I think that that's the fun part of it all. So I enjoyed it. It's hard work. I mean, it's what everybody says it is. It's difficult to get it right. I don't know if I did or not. That's for the reader to decide, but it's hard work.
Did you talk to a lot of colleagues to get their perspectives?
Not really. I talked to a lot of writers to get their perspective. I didn't really talk to a lot of my transplant colleagues. I felt like I knew that world, and I felt like I could describe it well. And I didn't really have them look at it. Some have been early readers of the finished product, and their reaction to it has been positive, which I think is good. I asked them if I got any of it wrong, and they said no, you did. They I think have been surprised at how much I've revealed about the world, but I don't think you sit down to write a book and say, well, I'm not going to tell the whole story because I don't want people, to know that. I think you have to, be fairly transparent about it and honest, and I tried to be.
Yeah. Has anybody done any kind of reporting on the more ethical issues like you kind of?
Yeah. There's just the beginning of that now. You see, let's call it in the last couple of years, a certain focus on the transplant industry, if you will. And it's more about, not as much about what I wrote about, but how organs get allocated throughout the country. It's a long, complicated process that we could spend the next podcast on. But there is some examination of the ethics, the financial incentive, all sorts of different things about how organs get allocated. Believe it or not, it may be no surprise. There's a lot of money in that too. That's a huge industry. And so there has been some reporting by Washington Post, say, and others that are talking about that now, just now, after, how many decades of doing transplants. So it's a relatively new topic of discussion.
Yeah, that was something that, again, I suspect many other people who aren't involved in all of that had never really thought about. Right. It seems so straightforwardly altruistic. Somebody donates organs, somebody who needs one gets one, everybody's happy. And so that was really an eye-opening thing to read about. And it made me wonder, just how much blowback there would be for someone who kind of blew the whistle on it.
Yeah, well, I'll find out. I did some of this in my first book, and there really was not a lot of blowback, just because, look, as long as it's the truth, very hard, to blow back too hard on it. I think that, we have to reveal these things. I love transplant as a field. That doesn't mean I can't criticize it.
Right.
I love my children, and I sometimes criticize them. I think that I love the field so passionately. I think about it all the time that I want it to improve. And if I can help in that way by exposing some of these things, then that's my role. I'm not trying to tear the field apart. I'm not trying to knock the people that do it for a living. I just want it to be better. And I think it can be better. But I think we have to reorient ourselves toward what really matters. Another shameless plug for the title. But we have to be clear-eyed that it really is about the person in the bed, in the hospital bed. And whenever we lose that focus, we start to stray. And maybe with my writing, I don't want to overstate my importance in the universe, but maybe I can shed some light on that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think if people are aware of the factors that go into it beyond the naively simplistic description that I just gave, that would help a whole lot.
I think so.
Yeah. And I also think, as I'm kind of reviewing parts of the book in my head, that I think one of the things that is really helpful about the novel is just that it's such a 3D image of someone who is a really, really talented guy at what he does, but is also a fundamentally flawed human being who, gets caught up in that world with all of its ethical dilemmas and has a pretty significant fall from it, but still remains a good guy underneath it all. Yeah. And has to kind of crawl out, and find himself again, but doesn't lose himself in it.
Yeah, I think that's real world kind of stuff. I mean, nobody's all bad, and my guy isn't either. I do think he's passionate about his work, and sometimes the passion shows up in maladaptive ways. But I think that's true to life. I mean, you see that in society, where some of the most brilliant people, also have trouble interacting with the rest of the world at times. And I wanted to show that my protagonist could care about his patients deeply, but also could be a pain in the behind to work with, and I think that dichotomy is something that's true to life. And it's certainly things that I saw.
Yeah. Yeah. And you also make it pretty clear where some of that comes from in his life, that it started long before he ever went to med school.
Long before. And I think it does in people. I mean, most people that do this kind of work, things have gone right for them a lot. And, they've had people like my guy did that have had huge expectations put on him. And he has been successful at meeting those expectations, generally speaking. And it's a burden to carry around. And I think that he didn't wear it well at times. And I just wanted to feel a life experience.
Yeah, the expectations came with a big cost.
Yep.
As they do with a lot of people.
I think that's right.
Yeah. Yeah. So I also have to say that I giggled with being both impressed and amused that you got Terence Blanchard to blurb your book.
Well, I'm glad that you know who he is. Everybody needs to know who he is. He's a genius. He happens to be a friend of mine, and is a creative genius in every way. And he is also somebody that inspires a lot of us to do creative things. And there's not a moment that I'm writing where his music isn't on. And I truly think that it inspires me to do better and dig deeper, because I think his music is very deep in the soul. And, Terence is somebody that I look up to. You can look up to your friends, and he's one friend that I really look up to.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I noticed that he turned up in the book. It's even better that he's a friend. That's great.
That's right. Yeah. That art form, jazz to me is life. It has everything in it, and Terence is an embodiment of that, I think.
I mean, you live in New Orleans. You're not allowed to live there if you don't like jazz, right?
I grew up with a guy on the corner that had a saxophone that blew it every morning. So, yeah, we have music here for sure.
Yeah, that's great. So you're working on a third book. What's the third book about?
I am. It's about identity, and it's specifically about religious identity, but it's going to
Oh,
be identity more broadly. And it kind of is a building block. I think my books are kind of build on one another a little bit. And my third book is going to be, I think they want it to be out in late 2025. So still working on it. Still have a lot of thinking to do around it, but that's the general topic.
cool. I'll be curious to see how that comes about. Since the first book was a memoir and the second book built on your own experience, obviously there's a connection there. Does the third one build on the first two, do you think?
I think it does, because I think that I've always been interested and had a complicated religious background. And I think that it speaks to a larger issue is how do we identify, like when we do look in the mirror in the morning, who or what do we see? And for me, a lot of times that was, I'm a transplant doctor. That's what I saw. And that was my main source of identity. But it also is a husband, a father, a friend to folks. And I got really interested in people that see themselves as a Catholic or a Jew or a Muslim. And I got interested in religion as a way to identify ourselves about who we are, what tribe we belong to, what team are we on. And that's what I'm writing about in this third book.
Well, I'll be interested to see how that goes.
Me too.
Especially since it can be such a fraught thing as we see in the world right now.
Yeah, I'm tackling these easy subjects, right?
Yeah. Let me know when you tackle the hard stuff.
Yeah, I'll get to that later at some point.
Yeah, boy, you have a lot to draw on at the moment for sure. If you decide to. So before we go, is there anything that you've learned in the process of writing either book, but especially of delving into fiction writing, that you would pass on to anybody who is considering taking a leap from something not related to fiction writing or to anything that they're currently doing, a creative endeavor that seems unrelated to what they've been doing with their lives?
I think follow your dreams and follow your heart. I think writing, it can be for just for you. It can be for the public. It can be to figure things out. For me, it's an incredibly important part of my life at this point. And I think it's such a great outlet for me. I can't do what Terrence does, but I can try to do this. And I think it's just like anything else. It's a lot of work, and the work pays off because, these aren't the best books that I've ever written. The next one's going to be a better one, and the next one is going to be better. And I want to grow as a writer, just the same way I grew as a transplant doctor. When I first started out, I wasn't as good at it, I don't think, as I was when I finished. And I look at writing the same way.
Yeah. That's the way it works. The more you do it, the better you get.
That's right.
All right. Well, I'll be curious to see where you go from here. Especially curious to see where this next book goes. So
thank you. I'm actually a little bit curious about that.
If you weren't, I'd be worried. So yeah, definitely keep us posted.
All right. Thanks for the conversation, Nancy. I enjoyed it.
That's our show. Thanks so much to David Weill for joining me and to you for listening. Please leave a review for this episode. There's a link in your podcast app, so it's really easy and it will only take a minute. If you enjoyed our conversation, I hope you'll share it with a friend. Thank you so much. If this episode resonated with you, or if you're feeling a little bit less than confident in your creative process right now, join me at The Spark on Substack as we form a community that supports and celebrates each other's creative courage. It's free, and it's also where I'll be adding programs for subscribers and listeners. The link is in your podcast app, so sign up today. See you there, and see you next week. Follow Your Curiosity is produced by me, Nancy Norbeck, with music by Joseph McDade. If you like Follow Your Curiosity, please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to tell your friends. It really helps me reach new listeners.